Ready?
Are we still in evolution? Yeah,
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think this is where we left off last time on that slide, is that right? I don't remember. Okay, so what we're doing here now is really talking about the transition of the aquatic ancestors to the terrestrial environment in terms of tetrapods. And that involves some changes, right? So we were talking about morphological changes. I think this is where we were. And so the basic idea, right, is you've got, if we go back to the possible ancestors, we've got two kinds of fish. Let's see if we remember that. So there's one type of fish that has ray-based fins, and those are the ray fin fish, Actinopterygii. Then the other group of vertebrates is Sarcopterygii, and those are the lobe fin fishes, specifically if we're talking about fishes, but also includes the tetrapods. And so what we're doing now is we're talking about how the transition of those Sarcopterygian forms into the terrestrial forms that we would refer to as tetrapods. And so we talked a little bit about the gills. So gills, of course, are respiratory structures that are really effective at getting oxygen from the water column, but once they're not kind of buoyed up by a dense medium like water, then they collapse, and that really cuts down on the surface area, so they're not very effective. And so in the terrestrial environment, of course, most animals are going to rely heavily on lungs, and so the key point of this was that the Sarcopterygian fishes at some point in their history had developed lungs already, right? So these animals are aquatic organisms with lungs, and that's because they lived in environments, aquatic environments that were generally low in dissolved oxygen, so warm water, shallow, swampy, lots of organic debris, etc. So they had lungs. Some other things that are associated with the transition, of course, would be the limbs. And so in fishes, the limbs or fins are mostly used for steering. And in terrestrial vertebrates, of course, the limbs are used for locomotion and other things too, but generally speaking, we're talking about locomotion. So some of the things, of course, that happen with respect to the limbs is that you've got these lobate fins. So the ancestors, of course, the aquatic ancestors already had kind of a precursors to that, internal bony support with muscles that attach to each one of those bony elements. And so the muscles would be what we would describe as intrinsic to the fins. And so the ancestors already had that. And so now to have effective locomotion on land, you have to modify that a little bit. And so in association with that, we talked a little bit about this too. The separation of the pectoral girdle, which is the bony elements that support the forelegs, the separation of that from the skull. And that, again, it's not directly related to locomotion, but it's influenced by locomotion, and the biology of the animal has to be modified a little bit because of the structure of the limbs and the skull. The other thing that happens in these animals as they make the transition is changes in the pelvic girdle, right? So the pelvic girdle for a ray fin fish supports what, would you guess? If you had taken ichthyology, for example, what would you guess?
I don't know, they comprehend these, I'm sorry.
The pelvic girdle.
Oh, the pelvic fin.
Yeah, it supports the pelvic fins, right? And so in fishes, that again, they're going to be used mostly for steering and balance and orientation, not so much locomotion, right? And so for an aquatic organism with pelvic fins, there needs to be some bony support to it within the body wall, but it doesn't have to be particularly rigid or connected to the vertebral column because it's not involved in locomotion. On the other hand, though, when you talk about these animals, now the pelvic girdle supports the hind limbs, and so the limbs are now used for propulsion. So when you have an action of the limbs, you want that to be pretty tightly connected to something rigid, right? So if the limbs are connected to something that moves, what happens when you push against it?
It moves.
It moves too, and the organism doesn't move, right? So if I want to pull a load I need to pull it with something that's not flexible, right? So if I pull a load with a rubber band, the load's not gonna move because the rubber band's stretchy. If you're connecting the structure that pushes the organism, what happened? If you connect that to something that's flexible, then it doesn't have the right response. And so the result of that is the pelvic girdle, which connects to the hind limbs, is now physically connected to the vertebral column, right? And so when you have an action of the limb that's connected to something rigid like the vertebral column, then the whole animal gets pushed forward, because if the vertebral column goes, so will the rest of the organism. Okay, let's see. Some other things that have changed include the internal nares, and so these animals have nostrils on the inside. So most vertebrates, maybe all vertebrates, have external nostrils. Like I said, in fishes, it's a blind sac. It is just used for sensing chemical cues, unless we're talking about the Sarcopterygian fishes. They also have internal nares, and that can also be used for respiration. So the nostrils are open to the outside, and then there's a canal, and there's an opening on the inside of the buccal cavity, and that allows the movement of air. So if you can drop the floor of the mouth, then air gets pulled in, then you can push that to the lungs, and you can effectively respire on land. And so this is what the internal nair looks like. So that's, if you climb through that, you come out on the external nair or the nostril. The other thing that has to happen, or not necessarily has to happen, but does, just because of the limitations of these organisms, is a loss of covering of the skin, right? So most fishes, including the Sarcopterygian fishes, most of them have bony scales that are not part of the skin, but they're embedded in the skin. And so because these organisms had relatively inefficient lungs, then another form of respiration for the early tetrapods and some fishes is cutaneous respiration, which is respiration what? Through the skin. But if there's scales on that, bony plates covering the skin, then that won't happen, right? So if these organisms are going to use terrestrial or atmospheric air to supply their oxygen needs, then they have to have skin that's available to absorb oxygen from the atmosphere. So scales won't do it. And so as we see the aquatic ancestors that have scales, which are great for protection against predators and microbiota and disease and things like that, in an organism that has very efficient gills, then that's great. But as soon as you move out, gills are gone, you can't have gills, and the lungs aren't very well developed. So an additional form of respiration is in the form of cutaneous respiration, but that can't happen if there's gills. So we see the loss of gills of those organisms. And so, the earliest tetrapods, that we're roughly calling amphibians, don't have scales on it. They have naked skin, which is awesome for cutaneous respiration. Terrible for someone, biologist, handling them that has bug spray on their hands, right? Because it's going to go right into the skin. But for respiration, it's great. Okay. Another thing that we see happening is a loss of the lateral line system, which is pretty typical of most aquatic fishes. The lateral line system mostly is a system that is similar to what our mechanoreceptors that we have in the inner ear. And so they're called mechanoreceptors because they respond to physical contact, in this case with water. So in fishes, it's very important because it allows them to respond to vibrations in the water column, and it functions by allowing water into these little pores on the scales of a fish. If you've ever seen the lateral line, so right down the middle of the side of the animal is a row of scales that have holes in them. That's the opening to the lateral line canal, which is right here. And then at the base of that, you've got these neuromast organs that are stimulated by the movement of water. So if water goes in there, pushes them back and forth, that sends a signal to the central nervous system, and the animal knows that there's something around or somebody's coming. That works great in water because water is dense and those things get pushed around. Air is not dense at all, and so if I blow on air, there's not going to be enough energy to move the elements of the lateral line system. So terrestrial animals don't typically have lateral line systems. There are some amphibians that do, but these are animals that are aquatic, right? So the larval salamander that we collected when we went out in the field the other day, if we had had a dissecting scope, you could have seen little pores on the skin. That's the lateral line system. So the aquatic larvae have it, but there are some adult animals that also have it. Things like the sirens are typical. So on this guy, you can kind of see this faint line right here. That's part of the lateral line system. So it still works in water in amphibians, but all the other amphibians are going to be terrestrial, so it doesn't work in a terrestrial environment. Okay, so I just put this up here so I can kind of show you really, I'm not really asking you to memorize this, I just want you to see it. And so mostly what we're talking about here is we've got, so this group basically starting right here, and all of these organisms are what we would call Sarcopterygiae, which includes the lungfish, the coelacanth, right? So, but it also includes mammals, birds, everybody else, right? All the terrestrial vertebrates. So this is Sarcopterygiae. We'd have another branch over here that would be what? Actinopterygiae. So you got two main types of aquatic vertebrates at this point. The ray finfish over here, and then the Sarcopterygian organisms over here. And so if you're taking ichthyology, I'm going to say Sarcopterygian fishes, which would include these guys, but it also includes all these others that aren't fish. All right, so, and that, again, that's why fish don't exist, because there's no taxonomic term. And so you got that group, and then what we're mostly talking about, you know, right in here is where we start seeing the transition of aquatic Sarcopterygians to the terrestrial ones. And some of these groups are of course extinct. Most of them are extinct. This group of course is not extinct, and that's the modern or extant amphibians, otherwise known as Lysamphibia. We talked about that. So there are amphibians that are not in this group, but they're also not living anymore, right? So they're extinct forms of what we would consider amphibians. And then you've got this group that's still got living forms, the Amniota, and we'll talk about those guys in a minute. So, and, you know, for this class, that would include what we would refer to as reptiles, plus some other organisms, right? So you've got, this is the Sarcopterygiae, this is the Lysamphibia, and then this is the next group that we'll talk about. And then these other groups are, you know, their records are members of these other groups. Some of them were the ancestors, you know, which one specifically we may not ever know, because we won't find those intermediate forms all the time. Okay, makes sense? Okay, so now what I want to do is kind of focus in a little bit on the Lysamphibia and just talk a little bit about some of the things that unite them together, right? So there are other amphibians that are extinct. The one group that represents the living amphibians all belong to the Lysamphibia. It's a monophyletic group, which means everybody in that group is each other's closest relative to the common ancestor that produced all of them. Right, so they share some derived characteristics, otherwise known as what? What are shared derived characteristics called? Synapomorphies, right? So all these guys, these things that we're talking about now are features that are different than the first amphibians, but they're shared among all the ones that are extinct. Anurans, caudates, and Gymnophiona. So they're derived and they're also shared among all the groups. And so pedicellate teeth just is a particular morphological form of the teeth in which the crown sits on a pedestal, right? So it's kind of got a flat base and it sits on top of that. They also have two auditory pathways. Auditory refers to what? Hearing, so they can hear in different ways. And so the way for most, or I guess the common way for most vertebrates is this pathway, the tympanum, right, which is what? What do we call our tympanum? Eardrum, right? So the tympanum is a membrane that will vibrate as sound vibrations hit it. The tympanum, on this diagram is right here, is connected to a bone or a series of bones, columella in this case, so here's the columella. And then the columella is continuous with the inner ear. And the inner ear is filled with fluid called endolymph. And so the basic idea, and then on the lining of the inner ear are sensory hair cells, just like on the lateral line system. So you've got these little neuromass basically that are wiggling back and forth, and that, and of course, they're connected to a nerve cell that goes to the central nervous system. Right, so in the way most organisms hear, you've got sound waves or vibrations that cause that tympanum to move, and then that causes the columella to move, and then that pushes against the endolymph, which is largely water. And one of the things that's true about water is it's not compressible, right? So if you push on water, what happens to it? Huh? Like if I have a balloon and I squeeze it, what happens to the balloon?
It pops.
Not necessarily.
It's smaller.
Not, it won't get smaller. I cannot take this and make it smaller because
It'll-
it's not compressible.
shape.
It's gonna move around to another spot. It's gonna find another spot, right? I'm gonna push it and it's gonna go whoop, it's gonna squirt over here. So water's not very compressible, which means if I push on it here, it's gonna move over there, right? So as this vibrates, then this endolymph vibrates and it shakes the sensory epithelial cells, and that says, okay, there's some vibrations in the area. So that's typically how these animals respond. And the Lis amphibian have another auditory pathway, and it's similar in that it's going to involve the inner ear because that's where the sensory hair cells are. The difference is how the sensory hair cells are stimulated, where that signal comes from. And so that's gonna originate typically at the limbs, right? Specifically the front limbs. So these animals have their front limbs on the ground, and then as the ground vibrates, so does the limbs, which are connected to the pectoral girdle. And then that is connected to the operculum, which is right here, right? So here's the muscles associated with the pectoral girdle and the forelimbs. Here's the operculum. The process is the same, but the pathway is different, right? So they can hear based on what's happening on the ground. And of course, you know, if you think about an amphibian, like a salamander, that could be quite a big thing, right? Because now I can hear bugs crawling in the dirt, and I can feel that on my forelimb, and I can hear it now. So, and all of them have that, right? So frogs have it, salamanders have it, and so do caecilians. And so it's pretty complicated, right? It's a complicated structure. They all have it. It's not like any of the other ancestors, so the logical explanation is that they all have it because they inherited it from a common ancestor, which again gets back to our monotype. They also have two sensory epithelial patches inside the inner ear, the papilla basilaris, which is again the hair cells that respond to the vibrations of the endolymph, and those typically respond to high frequency vibrations. And then the papilla amphibiorum, which respond more specifically to low frequency vibrations. Okay, again, so you can see that's a fairly complicated situation. The fact that they all have it is telling us something. They also all have some type of skin glands, which is obviously not unique to vertebrates, but it is something that unites these guys relative to their ancestors that apparently didn't have these things in great specialty, like the modern forms do. Okay, so there's basically two types. There's mucus glands and poison glands, and I'll talk more about this a little bit later when we talk about the animals themselves and their skin and stuff. But mucus glands mostly are kind of scattered all throughout the organism, and it produces kind of viscous, liquidy material that enhances cutaneous respiration. So their skin has to be relatively moist for cutaneous respiration to really be effective. And then the poison glands or granular glands are mostly in defense, and they typically tend to be more concentrated around the front end, the head, right? Because that's, you know, if you're a predator, that's kind of where you want to go first, because if you can interfere with that part of it, then the rest of it's going to be compromised pretty severely. They also have specialized receptors in their retina. So generally speaking, vertebrates have two different types of sensory receptors in their eyes. and those sensory receptors are in the structure of the eye, that's called the retina, which is the back of the eye. So light comes into the eye, is focused, and then stimulates specific types of cells. The main types of cells are rods, and the other main types are cones, right? So rods essentially respond to any type of light, energy. So if any kind of light gets into the eyeball, they're gonna be fired. Cones respond to specific wavelengths of light, right? So you've got, low frequency, medium frequency, high frequency, and you have different cones that respond to different wavelengths. So if you have cones, then typically the way we describe that kind of vision is color vision, right? Because if the light penetrates it, some cones are gonna respond this way, other cones are gonna respond a different way. If you only have rods, then you have no color vision because you can't distinguish anything. Anytime any kind of light hits any of those, they fire, right? So there's light, but we don't know what flavor it is because you don't have any way of distinguishing it. So amphibians have rods and cones, but they have two types of rods. The typical rod of the vertebrates and what are called green rods. They're not cones, which is unfortunately kind of confusing. They don't respond to green wavelengths, but and I'm not sure exactly the etymology of that name, but physiologically they're different. But they still are rods in that they respond to any kind of wavelength of light. And they have red rods, which are the typical vertebrate ones. Okay, another thing that's true about these guys is they have a particular type of muscle, and that is characteristic of all of them. And it's called the levator bulbi, and it's on the roof of the mouth of these particular organisms. So on this frog that's got his mouth open, the levator bulbi is the muscle, well, there's two of them, right? This is the right one and this is the left one. And those are kind of sheet flat-like muscles that are on the roof of the mouth. And typically, what is generally involves with is ingestion and swallowing. And so that muscle is going to be involved in pushing prey items into the esophagus, which in this case is right here. Right here. This is the lungs. That's where that goes to the lungs. And so if you've ever watched a frog or seen videos of frogs eating, you'll see their eyes are involved, right? So the eyeballs kind of push down, and that's when that contracts and that leaves space and the eyeballs sink down. So there's no palate between that and the eyeball, so there's just space here. And so, and that flexibility allows them to eat relatively large things, and then the eyeballs are kind of involved in that process. Okay, another synapomorphy of the Lis amphibia are short, straight ribs. And so, in contrast to other vertebrates that have ribs that do what? Not so much. If you've ever been punched in the ribs, you know they don't do that very well. But they're not short and they're not straight, right? So what are they doing? They're wrapping, and mostly they're connecting in the front, so making this thoracic basket. The Lis amphibia don't have that, right? So they don't have ribs that encircle the viscera. Some of the other extinct forms of amphibians did, right? And so this is a modification of that. So this is the typical ribs of an amphibian. So there's some other structures associated with that, but the very tips of that would be the ribs. They're really short and they're relatively straight. They don't curve around and make the thoracic basket.
I've never heard it called the thoracic basket. The ribs.
That's exactly what it's called, thoracic basket. Because it holds the thorax, right? And you've got all the good stuff in there. Okay, the other thing that's true about these guys is they have paired occipital condyles, which is kind of a bony extension on the back of the skull that interfaces with the vertebral column. Other terrestrial vertebrates have a single occipital condyle. So this is, of course, an ancestral versions did. So on this diagram, these are the occipital condyles, and that butts up against the first element of the vertebral column. And then, of course, So these are things, so Lis amphibia has been a taxon that's been recognized for a long time, mostly based on all these kind of specialized morphological things that are different from the first ones and shared among them all. And so again, that's likely explanation is that. And then of course, more recently, we have access to the underlying cause of most of our morphology, which is the genetic information, right? So when we look at molecular data, this is a cladogram, again, generated using DNA samples from a variety of amphibians. And I just put this in there because it's a cladogram, basically. But using the same data, this gives us the same information, right? And so you've got on this particular cladogram, you've got the animals that we're talking about right here, which are Lis amphibia. So if we put these guys in with a bunch of other tetrapods, using molecular data, we get this cluster, right? Which means that these guys are more closely similar, I guess, in their DNA than they are to the other members of the outgroup. And so this is where we would say is Lis amphibia right here. So in addition to the molecular data, we've got all these other morphological features that have been known for a while, but this just kind of confirms our suspicions that these animals are each other's closest relative in terms of the living amphibians. And they belong in their own taxon called Lis amphibia. Okay, so that's the kind of the history of the transition of the aquatic animals into a terrestrial environment, right? So now they're not aquatic, we're talking about these animals that are terrestrial, that live on land, but that, of course, is not the end of the story for herpetology because we have a whole other group to talk about, and that's the reptiles. And so, one of the main differences between reptiles and amphibians is that reptiles can occupy much, much drier habitats, and they don't have to be tied to water. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here. So a little bit about the advantages, right, which include a variety of things, of course. One of them is not so much an advantage, I guess, but just a result. Okay, so if we're thinking about these animals that have developed mechanisms to be out of the water on the terrestrial environment, they're still relatively tied to moist environments and relatively tied to at least temporary bodies of water for their reproduction because of specific features that they have, morphological and physiological. Once you've been able to develop mechanisms to avoid those problems, then that allows the expansion of your ranges. That by itself is not an advantage, right? So when we think about advantages for living organisms, what are the two things we're talking about?
Survival and reproduction.
Survival and reproduction, those are the things. Expanding your geographic range does nothing for either one of those things, unless it's tied to some other stuff, right? So just by itself, that's not really an advantage. The fact that I can go way over there is irrelevant unless way over there is a lot more food and less predation and more reproductive opportunities. And so that's, it's not really an advantage necessarily, it's just a result. If you can figure out a way to do it, then you can take advantage of some of the things that I'll talk about in a minute, and that's the consequence of that. The main advantages, of course, would be reduced competition for food. And why would you expect that to be true?
Nobody else is adapted to it.
Because there's nobody else here. Right? We're talking about other vertebrates. There's no other vertebrates in those habitats because nobody has figured out a way to do it yet, right? It's really easy to live in water. It's a little bit harder to live near water, but it's a lot harder to live away from water, and no one has developed the mechanisms for that. And, think about the history of life on Earth. And then, of course, on the other side of that, that's where everybody else is in terms of vertebrates that are possible predators, and so the reduction in predation is also a big advantage if we can figure out how to get away from all these other animals that have figured out how to live in moist environments. Okay, so of course the challenges are all going to be related to things that would keep us from doing those things, given a dry environment, and of course specifically the first one is just dehydration, right? So if you're an organism that is a salamander and you walk out of the forest into the open habitat,
almost immediately, what's gonna happen? You're gonna dry out, right? And that's why when we go looking for salamanders, we look in the forest and not in the parking lot, because they're not gonna come out there. Or in the open grassy habitat, or up on the rocks basking. They don't do that, because if you're an amphibian, you don't have the protection against letting the water just evaporate right out of the skin. So dehydration is obviously a problem. Respiration is a problem because of the dehydration, right? So if your lungs are fairly inefficient, then that means you're relying on cutaneous respiration pretty heavily. For that to be true and effective, you have to have a moist surface. So if you come out of the moist environment into the open environment, you're gonna dry out some. Not only do you not have enough water in your system, you also can't breathe. And so respiration is a problem. Another challenge, of course, is reproduction. And the main thing that's relevant for these guys is their form of reproduction. If we're thinking about amphibians. One aspect of their reproduction is most important in this part. What is it? What is it about their reproductive biology that influences where they can reproduce? They have to reproduce in water, but why is the question?
Because their eggs dry out.
Because an anamniotic egg, right? So the embryos will dry out. As soon as they get out of the body cavity of the female, they're dried up, unless they're in water. So you can't be out of the water, or you can't be in dry habitat. You have to be at least really moist, otherwise the embryos won't survive that. Okay, so some of the things that allow this to happen, right? And they're all connected, right? Because what living organisms do in terms of respiration, reproduction, anti-predators, that they're not independent elements, right? Just like herpetology is not completely independent of evolutionary biology. They're connected to each other. Organisms are the same way. So some of these things that you have to do also require you to have to do something else because they're connected to each other. So one of the things, of course, that the earliest reptile-like organisms displayed was a scalier skin, or a more waterproof skin. And this, of course, is scales of a snake. The scales are different than fish scales. Fish scales are made up of bone. Amphibians or reptile scales are made up of keratin, a type of protein. So it's not homologous, right? It evolved independently of what we see in fishes. So, it's kind of a backtracking, right? So you've got the fish that had scales, amphibians lost the scales. Well, if you want to be dry, you got to have scales again. And so, of course, that didn't happen the same way, which you would expect, right? So that's a complicated thing. Okay, so you've got scaly skin. It's got a lot of keratin in it. Beta keratin, particularly, is important in reptile skin. And the idea here is that the skin is hydrophobic. In other words, it's not attracted to water. If you drop water on a snake's skin, what's going to happen to it? They just roll right off, just like you just waxed your car. So it keeps water out, but that's not the function. The function is to do what? Keep water in. It also doesn't go the other way, right? So the scaly skin keeps the water in. So when you come out of the forest in the sun, all the water in the organism doesn't evaporate right off into the atmosphere. So that's what the skin does. Let me back up. Because that's true, now you have another problem, right? Because amphibians respire heavily through cutaneous respiration. That only works if you've got naked skin, right? You've got capillaries that are right next to the air. But if you've got capillaries that are right next to the air, you also are vulnerable to dehydration, right? Because all the water in the blood is going to evaporate right, unless you put a scale on top. Boom, perfect. Now I've got a scale on top, capillaries right next to the skin. I can't respire that way because I just covered it with a scale. So in addition to protecting the organism from drying out, that creates another problem. And so we also see not only just the formation of scales, but we also see I don't want to say improvement, but the modification of the lungs, right? And so the next thing that's associated with that is the lungs that are more compartmentalized, right? Which means each one of these things is tissue, and they're creating a compartment.
right? And so if you just look at a frog lung, here's the trachea, here's the frog lung. It's just a bag, which is good enough for getting oxygen, right? So, of course, the trick is to have these capillaries that are interfacing between the circulatory system and the air that's in there, right? So if you're a frog, you're gonna pull air in there, and then that air is gonna be exposed to the lining of the lung, and there's capillaries there that oxygen is gonna diffuse into the bloodstream or be grabbed by hemoglobin, we'll talk about that later, but you've got oxygen diffusing into the bloodstream, perfect. That's not very efficient, because it has relatively little what? Surface area. The only place in this structure where oxygen is being absorbed into the bloodstream is right here. But for a frog, that's fine. How come?
They're still respirating.
Huh?
They're still respirating through their skin.
Yeah, because they also have cutaneous respiration. Well, so they've got, on the outside, they've got, guess what, a bunch of capillaries. It's all over the organism. So oxygen's diffusing there into the bloodstream too. So that's fine. But as soon as you put a scale on that, then you don't have that anymore. So this has to be a lot better. And so you get that, right? And that's probably more like that's probably a mammal lung. But you get the idea, right? The lungs are much more compartmentalized. And so now you've got capillaries here, but you also have capillaries here. And every single one of these little walls and partitions have capillaries where oxygen's going into the bloodstream. And so that's gonna allow these guys to respire much more effectively without cutaneous respiration. Okay, what else? All right, so now we got another problem. And that relates to delivering it. Right, so if we think about where the blood that's absorbing the oxygen, where is that going? What?
Like through your circulatory system to your heart?
Well, some of it's going to your heart, but that's only because your heart is a muscle, and muscles demand what? Oxygen. Muscle cells demand oxygen, but what other kind of cells demand oxygen? All of them, right? So where's that oxygen going? Everywhere, right? So the oxygen that gets into the bloodstream has to be delivered to the cells. And if you're an organism that is not respiring through cutaneous respiration, only through the lungs, you better have a pretty good way of getting it to the cells. And so another thing that we see with respect to reptiles compared to amphibians is the circulatory system, specifically the structure of the heart is different. Okay, so this is a reptile heart, I think. Is that a reptile heart? Yeah, that's a reptile heart. So this is a reptile heart, and you can see that not absolutely, but mostly it has a 4-chambered heart. Here's 1, here's 2, here's 3, and here's 4. And what a 4-chambered heart does is allow the organism to get oxygenated blood to cells and unoxygenated blood to where? The lungs. And those two things are separated. When we come back on Wednesday, I'll talk a little bit about how that compares to the amphibian heart, so you can see why it's much more effective in the reptile.